Hello and welcome. This talk is Differences in Gradient Emotion Perception, Human versus Alexa Voices by Michelle Cohn, Eran, Raveh, myself, Kristin Predeck, Iona Gessinger, Bernd Moebius, and Georgia Zellou. And this is a collaboration of UC Davis and Universität des Saarlandes. So in the last decade, modern voice-activated artificially intelligent systems, or voice AI systems, such as Apple Siri, Amazon's Alexa, and Google Assistant have become a common household interlocutor for many human users, particularly in the United States. These systems engage users in a variety of functional and social tasks. For example, users may ask Alexa to turn off the light, tell a joke, or even have a conversation. The Computers as Social Actors framework posits that people automatically apply social behaviors from human-human interaction to their behaviors toward computers, given that acute humanity is expressed by the system. For example, there's some evidence that people hear emotion in TTS voices. So Nuss and colleagues in 2001 found that participants rated the emotion of synthetic and natural speech similarly when the emotional expression was congruent with the content. So for example, happy prosody with positive content. But in the incongruent conditions, so sad prosody with positive content, they observed differences for the human and the TTS voices in the relative weight listeners gave to the prosody relative to the content. So they rated synthetic speech as happier than human speech when it was produced with a sad prosody and happy content. There is some initial evidence that users may also be perceptive to emotional expressiveness in modern voice AI systems. So we've seen that speakers vocally align to emotionally expressive productions by the Alexa voice and also rate conversations with an Alexa social bot higher when the bot uses emotionally expressive interjections. But neither of these studies employed a direct human comparison. So the present study addresses this gap, examining whether listeners similarly perceive gradient emotion conveyed in TTS and natural human production. But there's recent work with a direct comparison to human and voice AI showing differences. Such a comparison is essential for evaluating predictions made by the CASA framework. People might apply social rules from human-human interaction to interactions with technology, but it is possible that there's still a distinction between real human versus voice AI. It is possible that while there are similarities in the growth patterns of social responses toward humans and computers, there may be a more fine-grained nuance to this. So particularly for more human-like expressions of emotion. So while the CASA account proposes an automatic mechanism of personification, there's reason to believe that any such response will vary considerably across individuals, especially for emotion. For example, vocal alignment toward voice AI, like Apple Siri, depends on the user's cognitive processing style. And in another study, Lee and colleagues in 2010 found that individuals interacting with the same robot receptionist communicated differently depending on their attitude toward the voice interlocutor. So as being more human, social, or a computational tool. So we ask whether we will see variation for displays of emotion by a voice AI system, which brings us to the current study. We had two main questions that we asked in this study. Our first question is, do listeners perceive acoustic variations conveying different levels of emotional states similarly for human and TTS voices? And our second question was, does an individual's gradient perception of TTS voice emotion vary according to the degree to which they personify the system? That is, are listeners better at perceiving emotion for interlocutors they deem as being more human-like? The study consisted of two parts. Our goal was to obtain ratings of emotionally neutral sentences. So we selected sentences that had previously been rated as emotionally neutral, as well as 94 declarative sentences from the speech perception and noise test. So that gave us a total of 120 sentences for an online emotional valence norming study. And we had 48 native English speakers who rated the emotion in all of the 120 sentences, which were randomly presented on the screen one at a time with no sound. And on the screen, you see some examples from the study. So for example, a bag is in the room, the sailors swapped the deck, or they played a game of cat and mouse. The second part was the perception study. And in the perception study, we selected the 15 sentences with the ratings closest to 50, so most neutral, from the norming study. We excluded imperatives and sentences with personal pronouns that may be incongruous if produced by a voice AI system. And this left us with the 15 sentences. We recorded a native English female speaker producing the 15 target sentences in citation format and generated the same 15 sentences with the default US English female Alexa voice using the Alexa Skills Kit. Next, we generated 3 happiness levels at 0, which was no change, 33%, and 66% happier with the David Emotional Synthesis platform in the Max programming language. We used the David default values for happiness, including a fundamental frequency increase of 30 cents and high shelf filter. We passed all sentences through the David resynthesizer at 0%, 33%, and 66% of the happiness parameters. So this resulted in a total of 90 stimuli. So we had 15 sentences in 3 happiness conditions and 2 interlocutors. And participants, none of whom completed the norming task, consisted of 99 native speakers of American English recruited from the UC Davis psychology subject pool. Our subjects completed the experiment online via Qualtrics. First, they provided basic demographic information as well as their voice AI usage. And next, participants completed an audio calibration step to ensure that the stimuli were audible and understandable via their own computer's audio device. Next, they completed a voice AI anthropomorphism survey adapted from Ho and McDormand. Using a sliding scale response from 0 to 100, our participants heard a single sentence produced by the Amazon Alexa voice, and this sentence was not manipulated in terms of emotion. And then they rated to what degree they thought the voice was machine-like or human-like, artificial or natural, eerie or comforting, or cold or warm. In the experimental trials, participants were told that they would hear sentences produced by either an Amazon Alexa or a real person, and rate those sentences and answer a few randomly presented listening comprehension questions. Participants were told that they would only hear each sentence once and to respond as quickly and accurately as possible. Speaker condition, so voice AI or human, was divided into blocks, so the order was counterbalanced across subjects. During all trials of each block, participants saw the corresponding Alexa or human silhouette on the screen, and you're seeing those silhouettes on the screen right now too. So you have Amanda as the human on the left and the Alexa silhouette on the right. On each trial, subjects heard an emotionally neutral sentence in one of the 3 happiness levels and rated it on 2 dimensions of emotion using a sliding scale. So we had valence from 0, which would be negative, 50, which would be neutral, to 100, which would be positive, and arousal. So 0 would be calm, 50 would be neutral, and 100 would be excited. And the sentences were only presented orally and were randomized by happiness level. So each participant rated all 90 stimuli, and in total, the experiment took roughly 30 minutes per participant. So just to give you an idea of what those different levels sounded like, we're going to play you 2 example sentences at 0% and 66% manipulation for both the human and the Alexa voice. And first, we're going to play you the 0% for the Alexa voice.
They played a game of cat and mouse.
And now 66%.
They played a game of cat and mouse.
And now the same sentence for the human at 0%.
They played a game of cat and mouse.
And the human at 66%.
They played a game of cat and mouse.
And now I'm going to turn it over to my co-author, Michelle, for the analysis and results section.
Okay, so I'll take you through the analysis and results. So we modeled the valence and arousal scores in separate linear mixed effects models, all with the same structure. So valence by happiness level, so 0%, no change, 33% happier, and 66% happier. Interlocutor being the human versus Alexa, and by subject random intercepts and by subject random slopes for interlocutor. So what did we find? So let's go through the valence first. Just to orient you, we have happiness level on the x-axis, so 0%, no change, and then 33 and 66% happier. Valence score on the y, so an increasing value here, these are all above 50, means that the subjects rated it more positive. And Alexa is in blue and human is in green. So here we found a couple of effects. First, we found an effect of interlocutor, so less for the human than the Alexa. We can see that here. We also saw an effect of happiness level. So relative to 0, sentences manipulated at the 33 and 66% manipulations were perceived as more positive. So that's a good sanity check. And we found an interaction between interlocutor and happiness level. So we can see that pretty clearly here as well. So larger increases for the human to 33 and 66% relative to 0, whereas the Alexa stays pretty flat. For arousal, so perceived excitement of the voices, again, we found differences. So based on happiness level, so relative to 0, we see an increase at 33 and 66%. Here we didn't see a difference based on interlocutor, but again, we did see an interaction with interlocutor and happiness level with a larger increase for the human here in green. So looking at these side by side, we can see similar patterns. So we see this increase for human, for valence and arousal based on the happiness manipulations, but really only an increase for the Alexa voice on perceived arousal or excitement, whereas it's pretty flat for valence, but still higher. So here we may have reached a ceiling effect. We also looked at individual differences in anthropomorphism as predicting perception of valence and arousal for the Alexa voice. So as Chris mentioned, we got their responses for how human-like, artificial or natural, eerie or comforting, cold and warm. They thought the Alexa voice, the baseline Alexa voice was before the experiment. And we summed these together, so a higher value for all of them means more personification. And we analyzed the subset of data just from the Alexa, modeling valence and arousal in separate models with that score, that composite score, by happiness level and interlocutor. So what did we find? Well, we saw an interaction between happiness level and anthropomorphism score. At 0%, we found that the participants rated the voices more positive at baseline as their anthropomorphism score increased. For arousal, we also saw an effect between happiness level and anthropomorphism score, again, in a direction we didn't quite expect. Individuals who had higher anthropomorphism scores perceived the voices sounding less excited at 66%. So the disassociation between these two effects, between arousal and valence, has been reported in literature, but this specific directionality wasn't one that we had initially predicted. Okay, so overall, we found evidence that listeners perceive emotion gradiently in human and Alexa voices. So we saw that for both dimensions, valence and arousal for the human voices, but this seems to be maybe limited to arousal for the Alexa voices. And in general, that we're seeing application of social knowledge from human-human interaction to human-computer interaction is in line with the computers are social actors framework. But you might be wondering why did we only see a gradient effect for arousal for the Alexa voice? One possibility is that there's a limit to technology personification. Maybe we can hear excitement in TTS voices, but we don't hear as being as positive or as negative with the same kind of gradient precision that we do for a human voice. On the other hand, as I mentioned, it could be just that the Alexa voice just sounded really positive overall and that we were hitting a ceiling effect here. But those, as well as some other limitations, can serve as avenues for future research that we're really excited to look at. So for one, we only use 2 voices and 1 in each category. So future work exploring multiple human voices, multiple TTS voices from different systems, for example, can really tease this apart in a more general way. Additionally, we only looked at one type of emotion, happiness. We thought that was a great place to start, but there are many other emotions we could look at and compare different magnitudes as well. And finally, this was really a passive listening task that listeners were doing at home with headphones. So we asked if this would be really different in a more kind of social interaction. We also saw some evidence for individual variation in emotion perception based on anthropomorphism. So a greater personification was linked to participants rating the Alexa voice as sounding more positive, but before manipulations, and rating the Alexa voice at 66% as less excited. We're still not sure why we found these effects. It's one possibility is that there may be other factors that are also leading to this variation. So for example, we didn't balance by gender. It's possible this may also be a contributing factor here. But there are many open questions to these patterns of variation. Okay, so overall, we found that some dimensions of emotion perception for human voices are also observed for Alexa voices, but really this is a nuanced relationship that really requires further study. So thank you to our participants and our funding sources. And thanks for coming to the talk.